In the quiet hours before dawn, when the great city of Rome still slumbered beneath a blanket of morning mist, few could have imagined that somewhere in the hills of Capua, a revolution was about to begin. Not in the marble halls of the Senate, not in the grand forums where politicians debated the fate of nations, but in the cramped, suffocating cells of a gladiator school, where human beings were bought, sold, and trained to die for the entertainment of others. The year was 73 BCE, and the Roman Republic stood at the zenith of its power. Its legions had conquered vast territories from Gaul to Asia Minor, bringing unimaginable wealth flowing into the coffers of the elite. Slaves from every corner of the known world filled Roman households, worked Roman fields, and died in Roman arenas. The system seemed unshakable, eternal, blessed by the gods themselves. But history has a way of humbling the mighty, and sometimes the most profound changes begin in the most unlikely places. This is the story of one such moment, the story of a Thracian warrior named Spartacus, whose name would echo through the centuries as a symbol of resistance, courage, and the eternal human desire for freedom. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. To understand the magnitude of what Spartacus accomplished, we must first understand the world that created him. The Roman Republic of the 1st century BCE was a civilization built on slavery. Historians estimate that at its peak, 1 in 3 residents of Italy was enslaved, perhaps 3 million souls bound in servitude. They were the invisible engine that powered Roman prosperity, the human machinery that made the grandeur of Rome possible. Spartacus himself came from Thrace, a region in what is now Bulgaria and parts of Greece and Turkey. The Thracians were renowned as fierce warriors, known for their skill with curved swords called sicas and their unwavering courage in battle. Ancient sources describe Spartacus as more than just a warrior. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed what the Romans called gravitas, a natural authority that commanded respect. Exactly how Spartacus became enslaved remains one of history's mysteries. The ancient historian Appian suggests he may have been a soldier who was captured and enslaved after deserting from the Roman army. Plutarch implies he might have been a Thracian chieftain defeated in battle. What we know for certain is that by 73 BCE, this proud warrior found himself in chains, property of Lentulus Batiatus, owner of one of Capua's most prominent gladiatorial schools. Capua, located about 120 miles southeast of Rome, was the heart of the gladiator industry. The city's schools trained thousands of fighters annually, feeding the insatiable Roman appetite for blood sports. But these were not mere training facilities. They were prisons, designed to break the spirit of proud warriors and reshape them into entertainment for the masses. Picture, if you will, the ludus, the gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus. Stone walls rising 30 feet high, topped with iron spikes and patrolled by armed guards. Inside, cramped cells barely large enough for a man to lie down, where gladiators slept chained to the walls. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. Men from across the empire, Germans, Gauls, Syrians, Africans, Thracians, all reduced to the same degrading existence. The training was brutal. Dawn to dusk, these men practiced the deadly arts of the arena. They learned to fight with different weapons, the net and trident of the retiarius, the short sword and shield of the secutor, the curved blade of the thrax. They learned to kill efficiently, dramatically, in ways that would please the crowds. But most importantly, they learned to die with dignity, for death was the most likely outcome of their training. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more devastating than the physical. Gladiators were forced to take sacred oaths, binding them to be burned with fire, shackled with chains, whipped with rods, and killed with steel. They were told repeatedly that they existed solely for the pleasure of others, that their lives had no value beyond their ability to entertain. Many broke under this pressure, becoming hollow shells of their former selves. But not Spartacus. Ancient sources describe him as a man who refused to be broken, who maintained his dignity even in the darkest circumstances. He spoke multiple languages, which was unusual for a gladiator, and this ability allowed him to communicate with slaves from different regions. More importantly, he possessed that rarest of qualities, the ability to inspire hope in the hopeless. Plutarch tells us that Spartacus's wife, a prophetess from his own Thracian tribe, had been enslaved alongside him. She had reportedly prophesied his greatness, claiming to have seen in omens that he would achieve extraordinary power but would come to a tragic end. Whether this story is true or merely a later embellishment, it speaks to the almost mythical status Spartacus had achieved even among his contemporaries. The conditions at the Capua school were particularly harsh, even by the standards of the time. Lentulus Batiatus was known for his cruelty, working his gladiators harder than most and feeding them less. The mortality rate was staggering. Most gladiators could expect to live only a few months after beginning their training. This was, after all, the point of the system, to create a steady stream of disposable entertainment for the Roman masses. But Batiatus may have underestimated the men he was trying to break. Among his gladiators were not just random criminals and debtors, but former soldiers, tribal leaders, and warriors who had tasted freedom and commanded respect. These were men with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from resistance. The exact moment when desperation transformed into determination is lost to history, but we can imagine it clearly enough. Perhaps it was during one of those suffocating summer nights of 73 BCE, when the heat in the stone barracks became unbearable. Perhaps it was after witnessing yet another senseless death in training, or after news arrived of particularly brutal games scheduled for the coming weeks. What we know is that Spartacus began talking to his fellow gladiators, not about escape, not at first, but about dignity, about what it meant to be a man, about the injustice of their situation. These conversations were dangerous. Gladiators caught plotting were crucified without hesitation. But Spartacus possessed something his captors couldn't foresee: the ability to unite men of different tribes, languages, and backgrounds around a single powerful idea: that no man should live as property of another. The conspiracy began small. Spartacus first approached Crassus, a powerful Gallic warrior who had gained fame in the arena for his ferocious fighting style. Crassus was everything the Romans wanted in a gladiator: huge, brutal, seemingly mindless. But behind those scars and that intimidating presence was a sharp intellect and a burning hatred for his captors. Next came Enemaus, another Gaul, whose leadership abilities had been noted even by the Roman guards. These three formed the core of what would become one of history's most significant slave rebellions. But they knew they needed more than just fighting ability. They needed careful planning, precise timing, and above all, they needed to inspire others to risk everything for the chance at freedom. The planning took weeks. They had to identify which gladiators could be trusted, which guards might be bribed or distracted, and how to obtain weapons. This last point was crucial. Gladiators trained with wooden weapons, and the real steel was kept under heavy guard. They would need to improvise, using whatever they could find. Kitchen knives, tools, even the furniture itself could be weaponized if necessary. The conspirators also had to consider timing. They needed a moment when security would be at its most relaxed, when the maximum number of gladiators would be available to join the escape. They settled on a day in late spring, when many of the school's gladiators would be gathered for a routine training exercise. According to Plutarch, the original plan involved about 200 gladiators. But at the last moment, their conspiracy was discovered. A fellow gladiator, whether through fear, coercion, or hope of reward, betrayed the plot to Batiatus. Guards were alerted, security was increased, and it seemed as though the rebellion would be crushed before it could begin. But sometimes the moments that seem like defeats become the catalysts for even greater victories. When Spartacus learned of the betrayal, he made a decision that would change the course of history. Rather than abandon the plan or wait for a better opportunity, he chose to act immediately with whoever was willing to follow him. On that fateful day, as the guards moved to arrest the conspirators, Spartacus gave the signal. What happened next has been recorded by multiple ancient historians, each adding their own details to what quickly became legend. About 78 gladiators were a fraction of the original number, but men who had decided that death in the attempt at freedom was preferable to slow death in captivity, burst from their quarters. They had few weapons: kitchen knives taken from the mess hall, a few tools stolen from the workshops, and their own desperate courage. The first target was the armory. The gladiators knew exactly where the real weapons were kept, and they moved with the precision of trained soldiers. The guards, caught completely off guard by the sudden violence, offered little resistance. Within minutes, the rebels had armed themselves with gladii, the short Roman swords they had trained with, along with shields, spears, and armor. But Spartacus understood that simply arming themselves wasn't enough. They needed to send a message, not just to their captors, but to every slave in the region who might be watching. They needed to prove that rebellion was possible, that the seemingly invincible Roman system could be challenged. The gladiators could have simply fought their way out of the city and fled into the countryside. Instead, Spartacus led them in a systematic destruction of the gladiator school. They broke open every cell, freeing every prisoner. They burned the wooden structures, destroyed the training equipment, and in a final symbolic act, they captured several of their former guards and forced them to fight each other to the death, a reversal of roles that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. The news of the escape spread with lightning speed. By evening, word had reached Rome itself, causing panic among the patrician class. But this was just the beginning. As the liberated gladiators moved through the countryside around Capua, something unprecedented began to happen. What Spartacus accomplished in the weeks following the escape from Capua was nothing short of miraculous. Starting with fewer than 80 men, he would build an army that at its peak numbered over 120,000 souls, the largest slave rebellion in ancient history. But this wasn't simply a matter of gathering angry slaves. Spartacus demonstrated a political genius that his Roman opponents consistently underestimated. He understood that successful revolution requires more than just military victories. It requires offering people a vision of something better than their current circumstances. The countryside of Campania, the region around Capua, was perfect for Spartacus's purposes. This was some of the richest agricultural land in Italy, worked by vast estates called latifundia that were dependent on slave labor. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved people, many of them recently captured prisoners of war from Rome's conquests, worked these fields under conditions that were often worse than those in the gladiator schools. As news of the escape spread, these agricultural slaves began abandoning their work and joining the growing rebel army. But Spartacus's genius lay in his inclusivity. His army welcomed not just slaves, but also free poor people who had been dispossessed by Rome's economic policies. Small farmers who had lost their land to large estates, craftsmen undercut by slave labor, veterans dismissed without the promised rewards, all found a place in Spartacus's movement. The rebel leader also demonstrated remarkable organizational skills. A lesser leader might have allowed the movement to devolve into random pillaging and revenge killings. Instead, Spartacus imposed discipline on his followers. They operated as a genuine army, with clear hierarchies, defined roles, and specific military objectives. Ancient sources describe the early structure of the rebellion as surprisingly sophisticated. Spartacus served as the supreme commander, but he shared authority with Crassus and Enemaus, recognizing that different ethnic groups within the army needed leaders they could identify with. This wasn't just political calculation. It was a practical necessity for maintaining cohesion among such a diverse force. The army's first major test came sooner than expected. The Roman government, initially dismissive of what they saw as a minor slave uprising, dispatched a small force under Gaius Claudius Glaber to deal with the problem. Glaber was a praetor, a senior magistrate, but he brought with him only about 3,000 hastily recruited militia, mainly young men with little military experience. Glaber's orders were simple: corner the rebels on Mount Vesuvius, where they had established their base, and either capture them or starve them into submission. It seemed like a reasonable strategy. The mountain had only one known path to the summit, and Glaber positioned his forces to block it. He then settled in to wait, confident that hunger and desperation would soon drive the rebels to surrender. This would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in Roman military history. Mount Vesuvius in 73 BCE was not the bare, ash-covered peak we know today. This was before the famous eruption of 79 CE that would bury Pompeii and Herculaneum. Instead, the mountain was covered with dense vegetation, offering perfect cover for a guerrilla army that knew how to use terrain to its advantage. Spartacus studied the Roman position with the eye of an experienced military commander. Glaber had done exactly what any conventionally trained Roman officer would do. He had secured the obvious route and settled in to wait. But Spartacus was not a conventional opponent. The rebel leader ordered his men to weave ropes from wild vines that grew abundantly on the mountainside. Under cover of darkness, small groups of rebels descended the steep, supposedly impassable cliffs on the far side of the mountain. They moved with the silence of hunters, positioning themselves behind the Roman camp while Glaber's attention remained fixed on the main path. The attack, when it came, was devastating in its simplicity and effectiveness. As dawn broke, the Romans found themselves surrounded. The main rebel force attacked from the expected direction, but simultaneously, the flanking forces that had descended the cliffs struck the Roman camp from behind. Glaber's militia, many of whom had never seen real combat, broke almost immediately. These were not the hardened legionaries who had conquered Gaul and Greece. They were shopkeepers' sons and farmers' boys pressed into emergency service. Faced with battle-hardened gladiators and desperate slaves fighting for their freedom, they had no chance. The victory was complete. Glaber himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing back to Rome with fewer than half his men. More importantly for the rebels, they captured the entire Roman supply train weapons, armor, food, and most crucially, military equipment that would allow them to equip their growing army properly. But Spartacus's true genius was revealed in what happened after the victory. Rather than executing the captured Romans, which would have been the expected response to years of brutalization, he treated them with unexpected mercy. Some were released to carry word of the rebels' strength back to Rome. Others were allowed to join the rebellion if they chose. This magnanimity served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that the rebel army was not simply a band of savage killers. It potentially weakened Roman morale, and it showed enslaved people throughout Italy that joining the rebellion offered them not just revenge, but the possibility of creating something better. The psychological impact of the victory at Mount Vesuvius cannot be overstated. For the first time in generations, slaves had defeated a Roman army in open battle. The news spread like wildfire throughout Italy, carrying with it a message that challenged the very foundations of Roman society. The slaves could fight, they could win, and they could organize themselves as effectively as any Roman force. Within days of the victory, Spartacus's army had swollen to over 10,000 followers. They were no longer just escaped gladiators and agricultural slaves. They had become a symbol of hope for the oppressed throughout the Roman world. The victory at Mount Vesuvius transformed what Rome had initially dismissed as a minor disturbance into a genuine threat to the stability of the Republic. In the marble halls of the Senate, where just weeks before the rebellion had been barely worth discussing, emergency sessions were now being called. The unthinkable was happening. Slaves were defeating Roman armies, and their success was inspiring uprisings across southern Italy. But to understand the true magnitude of what Spartacus had achieved, we must understand the world he was challenging. Roman society was built on a complex hierarchy that placed citizenship above all other considerations. At the top were the senators and equites, the political and economic elite who owned vast estates and controlled international commerce. Below them were the common citizens, the plebs, who at least had legal rights and the protection of Roman law. At the bottom of this system were the slaves, humans classified as property, with no rights, no legal protection, and no hope of advancement except through the arbitrary kindness of their masters. The system was maintained not just through physical force, but through a carefully constructed ideology that portrayed slavery as natural, necessary, and even beneficial for the enslaved. Spartacus was challenging all of this. His very existence as a successful military leader contradicted Roman beliefs about the inherent inferiority of enslaved people. His army's discipline and organization challenged assumptions about the supposed barbarism of non-Romans. Most dangerously of all, his success inspired others to believe that change was possible. Throughout Campania and Lucania, slave uprisings began erupting on individual estates. Plantation overseers were killed, manor houses burned, and thousands more joined the swelling ranks of Spartacus's army. But this wasn't random violence. Spartacus maintained strict control over his forces, directing their actions toward specific military and political objectives. The rebel strategy during this period was brilliantly calculated. Rather than attempting to hold territory, which would have allowed the Romans to concentrate their forces for a decisive battle, Spartacus kept his army mobile. They struck Roman positions, captured supplies and equipment, freed more slaves, and then melted back into the countryside before Roman reinforcements could arrive. This mobility was possible because Spartacus had solved one of the fundamental problems that had doomed previous slave rebellions: logistics. His army lived off the land, but not through random pillaging. Instead, they had created a sophisticated supply system that drew on the willing support of enslaved agricultural workers throughout the region. Grain stores were opened, livestock redistributed, and weapons workshops established to equip the growing army. Rome's response to this expanding threat revealed both the strength and the weakness of the Roman military system. The Roman army was undoubtedly the most effective military force in the ancient world, but it had been designed to fight conventional enemies using conventional tactics. The legions that had conquered Gaul and Greece were trained for pitched battles between organized armies, not guerrilla warfare against an enemy that could disappear into the civilian population. More importantly, the Roman system assumed that their opponents would fight according to the established rules of warfare. Spartacus recognized no such rules. He understood that this was not a contest between rival states seeking territorial advantage, This was a revolutionary war aimed at the complete destruction of the existing social order. The Senate's initial response was to dispatch another praetor, Publius Varinius, with 2 full legions, approximately 12,000 men. This was a substantial force, larger than many of the armies Rome had used to conquer entire kingdoms. But Varinius faced a problem his predecessors had not anticipated. He couldn't find the enemy. Varinius arrived in Campania in the autumn of 73 BCE, confident that superior numbers and professional training would quickly end the rebellion. His plan was methodical and, by conventional standards, sensible. Establish a base of operations, secure the major towns, and then systematically sweep the countryside until the rebels were cornered and destroyed. But Spartacus had no intention of allowing the Romans to dictate the terms of engagement. As Varinius established his base and began organizing supply lines, the rebel army seemed to vanish. For weeks, Roman patrols found nothing but empty camps, cold ashes, and reports from terrified locals of a massive army that had been there yesterday but was nowhere to be found today. This game of cat and mouse continued through the winter months, with Spartacus demonstrating a mastery of intelligence gathering that bewildered his opponents. The rebel army always seemed to know where Roman forces were, while the Romans rarely had accurate information about rebel movements. This wasn't accidental. Spartacus had created an extensive network of informants among the slave population, giving him eyes and ears throughout the region. The breakthrough came in early 72 BCE, when Varinius decided to divide his forces. Reasoning that a smaller, more mobile force might be able to track the rebels more effectively, he sent his legate, Furius, with 2,000 men to search the southern regions of Lucania, while he maintained the main force in Campania. This was exactly what Spartacus had been waiting for. The divided Roman forces were now vulnerable, and the rebel leader moved with characteristic speed and decisiveness. Furius's column was ambushed in the hills south of Potentia, caught in a carefully prepared trap from which few escaped. The rebels captured not just the military supplies, but also the sacred standards of the legion, an unprecedented humiliation for Roman arms. But Spartacus wasn't finished. Before Varinius could react to the news of Furius's defeat, the rebel army struck again, this time attacking Varinius's own camp in a night assault that caught the Romans completely off guard. The attack was not intended to completely destroy the Roman force. That would have been impossible given the size of Varinius's army, but rather to demonstrate the rebels' ability to strike at will, even against seemingly secure positions. The psychological warfare was as important as the military victories. Each success made Spartacus's name more famous throughout Italy, inspiring more slaves to join the rebellion while simultaneously undermining Roman confidence. For the first time since Hannibal had crossed the Alps 145 years earlier, an enemy army was operating freely on Italian soil, and Roman forces seemed powerless to stop them. The rebellion had also taken on an international dimension that worried Roman authorities. Emissaries from various enemies of Rome, including King Mithridates of Pontus, who was engaged in his own war against Roman expansion in the east, were reportedly making contact with Spartacus, offering support and coordination. The specter of a coalition between external enemies and internal revolution was Rome's worst nightmare. By the spring of 72 BCE, Spartacus commanded an army estimated at over 70,000 followers. This was no longer a slave uprising. It was a full-scale war that threatened the very existence of the Roman Republic. By the spring of 72 BCE, something unprecedented was happening in the heart of the Roman world. An army of former slaves, led by a gladiator from Thrace, controlled much of southern Italy and had proven capable of defeating Roman legions in open battle. But Spartacus's greatest achievement wasn't military, It was social. He had created something that Roman political theory claimed was impossible: a functioning society of free people drawn from the ranks of the enslaved. The rebel-controlled territories were not simply zones of chaos and revenge killing, as Roman propaganda claimed. Instead, Spartacus had established what amounted to an alternative state, complete with its own administration, legal system, and economic structure. Former slaves took on roles as administrators, judges, and military officers based on their abilities rather than their birth status. It was a radical experiment in human equality that challenged everything Roman society claimed to believe about the natural order of civilization. This transformation wasn't accidental. Spartacus understood that military victories alone wouldn't be enough to sustain his revolution. He needed to prove that former slaves could create something better than what they had destroyed. The rebel territories became a demonstration that the Roman system of slavery wasn't just cruel, it was unnecessary. The economic structure of the rebellion was particularly innovative. Rather than simply redistributing wealth from conquered Roman estates, Spartacus established workshops and farms operated by free labor. Former slaves who had been craftsmen before their enslavement, metalworkers, carpenters, weavers, set up operations that produced goods for the rebel army and surrounding communities. Agricultural land was redistributed to be worked by people who now had a stake in their own production. This economic reorganization served multiple purposes beyond simple survival. It demonstrated to skeptics that free labor could be more productive than slave labor, a revolutionary concept in a society that had built its prosperity on unpaid work. It also created a sustainable foundation for the rebellion that didn't depend solely on military conquest and plunder. But perhaps most importantly, it gave people something to fight for beyond simply revenge against their former masters. Spartacus had created communities where former slaves could experience dignity, where their children could grow up free, where they could participate in decisions that affected their lives. For many of his followers, this taste of freedom was worth any sacrifice to preserve. The military achievements during this period were equally remarkable. Spartacus had transformed a collection of desperate fugitives into one of the most effective armies in the Mediterranean world. His forces were organized along Roman lines but adapted to reflect the diverse origins of his soldiers. Thracian cavalry units provided reconnaissance and rapid strike capability. Germanic infantry formed the core of heavy combat units. Gallic warriors served as specialists in siege warfare and mountain fighting. The key to this military success was Spartacus's understanding that different fighting traditions could be combined more effectively than they could be replaced. Rather than trying to turn all his soldiers into imitations of Roman legionaries, he used each group's natural strengths while developing new tactical combinations that Roman commanders had never faced. The year 72 BCE would be remembered as the height of Spartacus's power, when his victories became so frequent and so devastating that they fundamentally altered Roman strategic thinking. The Senate, finally recognizing the true scale of the threat they faced, appointed both consuls, Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Lentulus Clodianus, to command the campaign against the rebels. This was an unprecedented step, reflecting the government's admission that they were facing not a simple slave uprising, but a genuine military challenge to Roman supremacy. The consuls brought with them 4 full legions, nearly 24,000 men, supported by auxiliary troops and allied contingents. This was the largest force Rome had ever assembled against an internal enemy, larger than many of the armies that had conquered foreign kingdoms. The plan was to coordinate their movements, using one army to drive the rebels toward the other, crushing them between 2 overwhelming forces. But coordination between Roman armies required communication, and communication required predictable movements. Spartacus had spent months studying Roman military doctrine, and he understood their preferred strategies better than they understood his. While the consuls carefully maneuvered their forces according to established tactical principles, the rebel army moved with a speed and unpredictability that turned Roman preparations into liabilities. The first major engagement occurred near Mount Garganus in Apulia, where Gellius had cornered what he believed to be the main rebel force. The battle began according to Roman expectations, disciplined legionaries advancing in formation against a disorganized mass of former slaves. But what Gellius had encountered was only a fraction of Spartacus's army, positioned as bait to draw the Romans into a predetermined killing ground. As the Roman advance committed itself to the attack, Spartacus's main force struck from the flanks, emerging from concealment in the forested hills that surrounded the battlefield. The rebels had learned to use terrain as effectively as any weapon, positioning themselves where Roman formations couldn't deploy properly and where the superior training of individual legionaries counted for less than the desperate courage of people fighting for their freedom. The battle at Mount Garganus was a tactical masterpiece. Gellius's legions found themselves surrounded, their formations broken by attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. What had begun as a confident Roman advance became a desperate fighting retreat, then a rout. Gellius himself barely escaped, leaving behind most of his equipment and nearly half his men. But Spartacus's greatest victory was yet to come. While Gellius limped back to reorganize his shattered forces, Lentulus moved to intercept the rebels in the Picenum region of central Italy. Here, on ground of Spartacus's choosing, the two armies met in what would become known as the Battle of Picenum. The engagement demonstrated the full evolution of Spartacus's military thinking. Rather than simply relying on ambush and surprise, the rebel army met the Romans in what appeared to be a conventional pitched battle. But appearances were deceptive. Spartacus had organized his forces in a formation that looked familiar to Roman eyes but operated according to different principles entirely. The battle began with a cavalry engagement on the flanks, Thracian and Germanic horsemen clashing with Roman and Italian allied cavalry. But while this contest raged, Spartacus was implementing a strategy borrowed from Hannibal's victory at Cannae 144 years earlier. The rebel center was deliberately weakened, designed to bend but not break under Roman pressure, while the strongest units were concentrated on the flanks. As the Roman advance pushed forward, believing they were breaking the rebel line, they found themselves drawn into a carefully prepared trap. The rebel flanks closed in, surrounding the Roman formation just as their ancestors had done to Roman armies at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. But this time, it was former Roman slaves who were implementing the strategy that had once brought the Republic to the brink of destruction. Lentulus' army was annihilated. The consul himself was killed in the fighting, along with most of his senior officers. The survivors scattered across the countryside, many of them deserting rather than face the humiliation of explaining their defeat to the Senate. In a single afternoon, Spartacus had destroyed 2 full legions and eliminated one of Rome's most experienced commanders. The political impact of these victories reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman allies began questioning their commitment to a government that seemed unable to maintain control over its own territory. Enemy kingdoms took note of Roman vulnerability and began preparing their own challenges to Roman authority. Most dangerously of all, slave populations throughout the empire began showing signs of unrest, inspired by Spartacus's example. For a brief, shining moment in 72 BCE, it seemed possible that Spartacus might actually achieve the impossible, the complete overthrow of the Roman slave system and its replacement with a society based on human equality. His army controlled most of southern Italy, had defeated every force sent against it, and was growing stronger with each victory. But success would bring its own challenges. In the summer of 72 BCE, as reports of Roman defeats flowed into the capital like a rising tide of catastrophe, Spartacus stood at the pinnacle of his power and faced the most crucial decision of his life. His army now numbered over 120,000 souls, are not just fighters, but entire communities of people who had cast their lot with the rebellion. They controlled territory from Naples to Brundisium, had defeated every Roman force sent against them, and had proven that a society without slavery could not only survive but prosper. Yet with this success came a fundamental strategic question that would ultimately determine the fate of the rebellion. What was the ultimate goal of their struggle? Was it simply to escape Roman territory and return to their homelands? Was it to carve out an independent state within Italy? Or was it something far more ambitious, the complete transformation of the Roman world itself? This question had been simmering beneath the surface of the rebellion since its earliest days, but the time for avoiding difficult decisions had passed. The rebel army stood at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. To the north lay the Alps and the possibility of escape to freedom. To the south lay Sicily, with its massive slave population waiting to be liberated. To the east lay the sea and potential allies among Rome's enemies. Each path represented a different vision of what the rebellion could become. The debate within the rebel leadership reflected the diverse origins and motivations of their followers. Crassus, the Gallic gladiator who had been one of the original conspirators, argued passionately for marching north to the Alps. His people, he claimed, were waiting in Gaul for liberation. If they could cross the mountains with their army intact, they could establish a base beyond Roman reach and potentially coordinate with other enemies of Rome. Enemaus, the other Gallic leader, supported a different approach. He advocated for establishing a permanent base in southern Italy, using their military success to negotiate a settlement with Rome that would guarantee freedom for the rebels and perhaps broader reforms to the slave system. This was the most conservative option, but also potentially the most sustainable. A third faction, composed mainly of slaves from the eastern Mediterranean, pushed for an ambitious naval campaign. They wanted to capture ships and transport the army to Sicily, where the massive slave population of the grain estates could be liberated to join their cause. From there, they argued, the rebellion could spread throughout the empire's eastern provinces. But there was a fourth option, one that Spartacus himself seemed to favor, though he rarely spoke of it directly. This was the most radical possibility of all, remaining in Italy and attempting to destroy the Roman slave system entirely. This path offered the greatest potential rewards but also the greatest risks. It would mean permanent war with the most powerful military force in the ancient world, with no possibility of compromise or retreat. The complexity of this decision cannot be overstated. Each option represented not just a military choice but a fundamental philosophical position about the nature and purpose of the rebellion. The Alps route offered safety but potentially limited impact. Even if successful, it would leave the Roman slave system intact and millions of people still in bondage. The Sicily option promised to expand the rebellion but risked dispersing their forces across difficult terrain and potentially hostile waters. The negotiation option might preserve the lives and freedom of current rebels but would likely require compromising with the very system they had fought to destroy. The all-or-nothing approach of remaining in Italy offered the possibility of genuine revolutionary change, but at enormous risk to everyone who had joined the cause. Spartacus's own position in these debates reveals much about his character and his vision for the rebellion. Unlike many successful military leaders, he seems to have been genuinely reluctant to impose his will on his followers. The army had developed a remarkably democratic decision-making process, with major strategic choices debated in councils that included representatives from different ethnic and regional groups. This democratic approach was both a strength and a weakness. It ensured broad support for whatever decision was ultimately made, but it also made rapid responses to changing circumstances more difficult. As the Roman government began organizing its response to the rebellion's success, time was becoming a critical factor. The Roman response to their military disasters was characteristically systematic and ruthless. The Senate had initially tried to treat the rebellion as a domestic police matter, then as a routine military campaign. Both approaches had failed catastrophically, and now they were preparing to treat it as what it had actually become, an existential threat to the Roman system. The man chosen to lead this final campaign was Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most politically ambitious men in Rome. Crassus was not just wealthy, he was spectacularly wealthy, with a fortune built on real estate speculation and slave trading. His personal stake in preserving the slave system was enormous, but more importantly, he understood that success against Spartacus could provide the military glory he needed to compete with rivals like Pompey and Caesar for supreme power in Rome. Crassus was given unprecedented authority and resources. The Senate authorized him to recruit not just additional legions, but also to employ auxiliary troops, allied contingents, and even hire mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. More importantly, they gave him the authority to use any methods necessary to end the rebellion, including tactics that might normally be considered excessive even by Roman standards. The appointment of Crassus marked a fundamental shift in Roman strategy. Previous commanders had treated the rebellion as a conventional military problem to be solved through conventional means. Crassus understood that he was fighting a revolutionary war that threatened the foundations of Roman society, and he was prepared to use revolutionary methods in response. As news of Crassus's appointment and the massive military buildup reached the rebel camps, the urgency of the strategic decision became clear. The time for gradual expansion and careful consolidation was over. The rebellion would now face the full might of Rome, commanded by a leader who understood exactly what was at stake. The debates within the rebel council intensified. Some argued that Crassus's appointment actually strengthened the case for immediate departure from Italy, better to preserve their forces and continue the struggle from a position of safety than to face annihilation against overwhelming odds. Others contended that leaving now would betray everyone who had joined the rebellion, believing it could actually change the world. The fracture that would ultimately doom the rebellion began not with military defeat, but with this fundamental disagreement about strategy and purpose. In the late summer of 72 BCE, as Crassus was assembling his forces in Rome, the unity that had been Spartacus's greatest strength began to crack. The break came when Crassus, frustrated by what he saw as endless debate and indecision, announced that he and his followers would no longer be bound by the collective decisions of the rebel council. The Gallic contingent of the army, numbering approximately 30,000 warriors, would strike out on their own, pursuing their own objectives through their own methods. This was devastating news for Spartacus. Crassus was not just another subordinate commander. He was one of the original conspirators, a charismatic leader in his own right, and the primary connection between Spartacus and the large Gallic population within the army. His departure would weaken the rebellion militarily, but more importantly, it would send a message to Rome and to potential supporters that the rebel coalition was fracturing. Spartacus reportedly pleaded with Crassus to reconsider, warning that division would make them vulnerable to Roman counterattack. But Crassus was adamant. He had not endured slavery and risked everything in rebellion simply to spend the rest of his life debating strategy in council meetings. He wanted action, and if Spartacus wouldn't provide it, he would take his followers and create his own campaign. The two men, who had been brothers in bondage and partners in liberation, parted as rivals. Crassus led his forces south, toward the rich cities of Magna Graecia, while Spartacus remained in the north with the remainder of the army. It was a division that Crassus would exploit with deadly effectiveness. Crassus arrived in the theater of operations in the autumn of 72 BCE with 8 full legions, nearly 50,000 men, the largest army assembled by Rome since the wars against Hannibal. But more important than the numbers was Crassus's approach to the campaign. He understood that previous commanders had failed because they had tried to fight the rebellion using conventional tactics against an unconventional enemy. Instead, Crassus implemented a strategy of systematic elimination. Rather than seeking a single decisive battle, he divided his forces into multiple columns that would sweep through rebel-controlled territory methodically, destroying infrastructure, eliminating support networks, and forcing the rebels into increasingly desperate situations. The strategy worked exactly as planned. Crassus, operating independently and lacking the intelligence network that Spartacus had built over months of careful preparation, found himself cornered by a force under Marcus Mummius near Mount Garganus. Ironically, the same location where Spartacus had won one of his greatest victories against Gellius. But this time, the outcome was different. Crassus's forces, though brave and experienced, were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The battle was brief and brutal. Crassus himself fell in the fighting, along with most of his followers. The survivors scattered into the mountains, no longer an effective military force. When news of Crassus's death reached Spartacus, the rebel leader's response revealed both his humanity and his strategic brilliance. Rather than simply mourning his fallen comrade, Spartacus organized elaborate funeral games in Crassus's honor, forcing captured Romans to fight as gladiators in tribute to the dead Gallic leader. It was a powerful symbolic gesture that served multiple purposes. It honored Crassus, provided closure for his grieving followers, and sent a clear message to Rome about the rebels' continued strength and determination. But the symbolic victory could not disguise the strategic reality. The rebellion had lost nearly a quarter of its fighting force and one of its most capable commanders. More importantly, the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the rebel army was broken. Crassus had proven that the rebels could be defeated, given sufficient resources and proper tactics. Spartacus now faced the full weight of Roman power with a weakened army and limited options. The debates that had divided the rebel leadership were now moot. Survival had become the only realistic objective. The question was no longer what kind of society they wanted to create, but whether any of them would live to see another spring. Yet even in this desperate situation, Spartacus demonstrated the qualities that had made him such an extraordinary leader. Rather than succumbing to despair or lashing out in futile gestures of defiance, he began planning one of the most audacious military campaigns in ancient history, a fighting retreat that would take his army the length of Italy in a final attempt to preserve the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. The plan was breathtakingly ambitious. Spartacus would lead his remaining forces, still numbering close to 90,000 people, including non-combatants, in a march to the southern tip of Italy. There, he would negotiate with Cilician pirates to transport his army across the narrow strait to Sicily, where the massive slave population of the grain estates could be liberated to join a renewed rebellion. It was a desperate gamble, but it offered the only realistic hope of long-term survival. Sicily was an island, defensible with naval support, and its economy was even more dependent on slave labor than mainland Italy. If Spartacus could establish a base there, he might be able to create the kind of independent state that would allow his followers to live in freedom while continuing to inspire resistance throughout the Roman world. But first, he had to get there. Between his current position in central Italy and the ports of Bruttium lay hundreds of miles of Roman-controlled territory, defended by the largest army Rome had ever assembled for internal operations. Every mile of that journey would be contested, every river crossing a potential disaster, every mountain pass a possible trap. Crassus, meanwhile, was implementing the second phase of his strategy. Having eliminated the divided Gallic forces, he now turned his attention to the main rebel army. But rather than pursuing them directly, which might allow them to use their superior mobility and knowledge of the terrain, he began constructing a series of fortified positions that would limit their movements and force them into increasingly constrained areas. This was siege warfare on a massive scale, not the siege of a city, but the siege of an entire army and the civilian population that traveled with it. Crassus understood that time was now on his side. Winter was approaching, supplies would become increasingly difficult to obtain, and the rebels would be forced to make desperate choices that might provide opportunities for decisive action. The cat-and-mouse game that followed over the autumn and early winter of 72 to 71 BCE was a masterpiece of strategic maneuvering on both sides. Spartacus demonstrated his continued brilliance as a military commander, repeatedly outfoxing Roman attempts to corner his forces while maintaining discipline and morale among his followers despite increasingly desperate circumstances. But the weight of Roman resources was beginning to tell. Every skirmish, even when won by the rebels, cost them casualties they could not replace. Every day of the campaign brought them closer to starvation and exhaustion. Most critically, the approach of winter meant that the civilian population traveling with the army, women, children, elderly followers who had joined the rebellion seeking freedom, were facing increasingly harsh conditions that sapped the strength of the entire force. Spartacus's march toward Bruttium became a race against time, weather, and the inexorably closing net of Roman forces. It was during this period that he performed perhaps his greatest feat as a military commander, keeping an army of nearly 100,000 people together, disciplined and effective while under constant pressure from multiple Roman columns, with winter approaching and supplies running critically low. The rebels moved primarily at night, using their knowledge of local terrain and their network of sympathizers among the slave population to stay ahead of Roman pursuit. They traveled light, abandoning all non-essential equipment and living off what they could forage or capture from Roman supply trains. It was a testament to Spartacus's leadership that this desperate retreat never devolved into a disorganized flight. But Crassus was a patient and methodical opponent. Rather than allowing frustration to drive him into the kind of reckless pursuit that had doomed his predecessors, he maintained constant pressure while positioning his forces to cut off potential escape routes. He understood that he didn't need to destroy the rebel army in battle. He simply needed to force them into a position where they had no good options remaining. The climax of this campaign came when Spartacus reached the southern tip of Italy and attempted to implement his plan for escaping to Sicily. The Cilician pirates, who had initially agreed to transport the rebel army across the strait in exchange for a substantial payment in captured Roman gold, proved treacherous at the crucial moment. Whether they had been bribed by Crassus, intimidated by the Roman naval presence in the area, or simply decided that the risks outweighed the potential rewards, they failed to appear at the appointed time and place. This betrayal left Spartacus in an impossible position. His army was trapped on the Bruttium Peninsula, with Crassus's forces controlling the only land route back to the north and the sea offering no possibility of escape. For the first time since the rebellion had begun nearly 2 years earlier, Spartacus found himself with no good options, no clever stratagem that could transform defeat into victory. It was at this moment of ultimate crisis that Spartacus demonstrated why he had become such an enduring symbol of human dignity and resistance. Faced with the certainty of defeat and death, he could have attempted to save himself through surrender or betrayal of his followers. Instead, He chose to remain with his army and face whatever fate awaited them together. The final phase of the rebellion began when Crassus constructed a massive wall across the neck of the Bruttium Peninsula, effectively sealing the rebels into their southern refuge. This wall, stretching from sea to sea and defended by numerous fortified positions, was one of the most impressive engineering achievements in Roman military history. It demonstrated Crassus's determination to end the rebellion completely and his willingness to invest whatever resources were necessary to achieve that goal. For weeks, the rebels were trapped behind this wall while their supplies dwindled and their situation grew increasingly desperate. Spartacus made several attempts to break through the Roman fortifications, but each assault was repelled with heavy casualties. The rebels' superior mobility and tactical flexibility, which had served them so well in the open countryside, were useless against fixed fortifications defended by professional soldiers with adequate supplies and secure lines of communication. As winter deepened and food became critically scarce, discipline within the rebel army began to break down for the first time since the rebellion had begun. Desperate groups attempted unauthorized breakout attempts, only to be slaughtered by waiting Roman forces. Others advocated for surrender, arguing that slavery was preferable to starvation. The unity that had been Spartacus's greatest strength was finally cracking under the pressure of seemingly hopeless circumstances. But Spartacus himself remained resolute. According to ancient sources, he used this period of enforced inactivity to prepare his followers for what he now recognized would be their final battle. He gave speeches reminiscent of the conversations that had first inspired the rebellion in the gladiator school at Capua, reminding his followers of what they had achieved, what they had created, and what their struggle had meant for oppressed people throughout the Roman world. The breakout, when it finally came, was achieved through a combination of desperation, ingenuity, and sacrifice that epitomized the entire rebellion. During a fierce winter storm that reduced visibility and made Roman patrols less effective, small groups of rebels filled in sections of the wall using captured equipment, debris, and even the bodies of their own dead. Working in absolute silence and darkness, they created several narrow passages through the fortifications. The escape was only partially successful. Perhaps half the rebel army managed to break through before Roman forces responded and sealed the gaps. The remainder, including many of the non-combatants who had followed Spartacus since the early days of the rebellion, were trapped behind the wall and would face capture or death in the coming weeks. Those who escaped found themselves in a situation that was desperate but not yet hopeless. They were free of Crassus's trap, but they were also cut off from their supplies, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, and pursued by an enemy who now held every advantage except the rebels' unbroken determination to remain free. Spartacus, who had managed to escape with the main body of his fighting force, now faced the final strategic decision of his life. He could attempt to break through Roman lines and escape to the north, possibly reaching Gaul or Germania where his followers might find sanctuary among peoples still free from Roman rule. Alternatively, he could turn and fight, using what remained of his strength to inflict maximum damage on the Roman forces that had pursued him for so long. The choice he made revealed the true nature of his character and his understanding of what the rebellion had become. Rather than fleeing north toward potential safety, Spartacus turned his army around and began marching back toward Crassus's main force. He had decided to seek the decisive battle that he had avoided for so long, but now on his own terms and for his own reasons. This decision has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. Some argue that Spartacus had simply recognized the futility of further flight, that his weakened army could never outrun the Roman forces and would inevitably be hunted down and destroyed piecemeal. Others suggest that he hoped to win one final victory that might allow him to reestablish his position and continue the rebellion. But the most compelling explanation, supported by the testimony of ancient sources who had access to eyewitness accounts, is that Spartacus had decided to transform his inevitable defeat into a statement that would resonate through the ages. He would show the world that slaves could not only fight for their freedom but could die for it with a dignity and courage that their masters had claimed they could never possess. The final battle of the Third Servile War took place in Lucania in the spring of 71 BCE. The exact location is disputed by historians, but the events of that day are recorded in sufficient detail to understand both its immediate outcome and its lasting significance. Spartacus drew up his army in a formation that was unmistakably Roman in its organization and discipline. The rebels had learned well from their victories and defeats over the past 2 years, and they now fought with a professionalism that would have done credit to any legion. But this was more than military technique. It was a final demonstration that the supposed natural inferiority of enslaved people was a lie that could no longer be sustained. Before the battle began, Spartacus performed one last act that encapsulated everything the rebellion had represented. He ordered his personal horse to be brought forward and killed it with his own sword, declaring that he would either win the coming battle or die in it. There would be no retreat, no flight, no survival except through victory. This gesture sent a clear message both to his own followers and to the Roman forces arrayed against them. The man who had led the greatest slave rebellion in ancient history would face his end on foot, as an equal among equals, sharing the fate of the humblest followers who had believed in his vision of a world without masters and slaves. The battle itself was fierce and bloody, lasting for several hours as Roman discipline and superior numbers ground against rebel determination and skill. Contemporary accounts describe fighting of extraordinary intensity, with both sides understanding that this engagement would determine not just the fate of the rebellion, but the very possibility of challenging the Roman system of slavery. Spartacus himself fought in the front ranks, leading by example as he had throughout the rebellion. Ancient sources describe him cutting down 2 centurions in single combat before being overwhelmed by the press of Roman soldiers. He died as he had chosen to live in his final years, as a free man fighting for the freedom of others. The rebel army fought with desperate courage, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Crassus had brought overwhelming force to bear, and the rebels, weakened by months of pursuit and privation, could not sustain their resistance indefinitely. By day's end, most of Spartacus's followers lay dead on the battlefield, including virtually all of the military leadership that had guided the rebellion through its greatest victories. 6,000 survivors were captured and would face a fate that revealed the true brutality underlying Roman civilization. Crassus ordered them to be crucified along the Appian Way, the great road that led from Capua to Rome. Their bodies would hang there for months, a visible reminder to every traveler of what happened to those who dared challenge the existing order. This mass crucifixion was intended as more than just punishment. It was psychological warfare aimed at deterring future rebellions. But in many ways, it had the opposite effect from what Crassus intended. The sight of 6,000 crosses bearing the bodies of people who had died for freedom became a powerful symbol that would inspire resistance movements for centuries to come. Spartacus's body was never found among the dead, leading to legends that he had somehow survived the final battle. These stories, while almost certainly false, speak to the mythic status he had already achieved even among his enemies. The Roman historian Florus wrote that Spartacus had died like a general should die, while Plutarch described him as a man of great spirit and physical strength, who had shown that slaves could possess the same virtues that Romans claimed for themselves. But the true measure of Spartacus's achievement goes beyond his military victories or even his dignified death. In the space of less than 3 years, he had fundamentally challenged the assumptions on which Roman society was built. He had proven that enslaved people could organize themselves as effectively as any free citizens, that they could create functional communities based on principles of equality and mutual respect, and that they could fight and die with honor for ideals larger than their own survival. The rebellion had also demonstrated the fundamental instability of a society built on slavery. The ease with which Spartacus had recruited followers throughout Italy revealed how many people were living on the margins of Roman society, excluded from its benefits while bearing its costs. The rebels had included not just slaves but free poor people, displaced farmers, and others who had been left behind by Rome's economic expansion. This broad base of support showed that the rebellion was not simply a matter of slaves seeking personal freedom, but a genuine social movement that challenged the entire structure of Roman society. The fact that it had taken the full resources of the Roman state, commanded by one of its most capable leaders, to defeat what had begun as fewer than 80 escaped gladiators demonstrated just how fragile the existing system really was. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion saw a tightening of controls on the slave population throughout Italy. New laws were passed restricting the movement and assembly of enslaved people, and punishments for attempted rebellion became even more severe than they had been before. In the short term, Spartacus's defeat seemed to have strengthened rather than weakened the Roman slave system. But the long-term impact was more complex and ultimately more significant. The rebellion had shown that resistance was possible, that the supposedly natural order of Roman society could be challenged, and that enslaved people were capable of achieving remarkable things when given the opportunity. These lessons could not be erased by legislation or intimidation. The story of Spartacus also had a profound impact on Roman political development. Crassus's victory in the slave war provided him with the military credentials he needed to join Pompey and Caesar in the First Triumvirate, the informal alliance that would dominate Roman politics for the next decade. The resources and methods Crassus had developed to defeat the rebellion would later be used in Rome's expansion into Gaul and the Eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, the rebellion had demonstrated the potential for internal threats to Roman stability at a time when the Republic was already showing signs of political strain. The techniques Crassus used against Spartacus, massive mobilization of resources, suspension of normal legal procedures, use of extreme violence against civilians, would become increasingly common in Roman political conflicts as the Republic moved toward civil war and eventual transformation into the empire. The intellectual impact of the rebellion was equally significant. Roman philosophers and historians struggled to explain how enslaved people had been able to achieve what Spartacus's followers had accomplished. Some, like Florus, acknowledged that the rebels had displayed virtues that Romans claimed for themselves. Others attempted to minimize the achievement by arguing that the rebellion's leaders must have been exceptional individuals whose abilities were not representative of the enslaved population as a whole. But these explanations could not completely obscure the fundamental challenge the rebellion had posed to Roman ideology. If slaves could organize armies, establish governments, create economic systems, and die heroically for abstract principles, then the entire justification for slavery, that it was a natural condition suited to naturally inferior people, was called into question. This intellectual ferment would continue long after the rebellion itself was crushed. Roman writers continued to grapple with the implications of Spartacus's achievements, and their works would eventually influence later thinkers who would more explicitly challenge the morality and sustainability of slavery as an institution. The legend of Spartacus spread far beyond the boundaries of the Roman world. In the Eastern Mediterranean, among peoples who were themselves under pressure from Roman expansion, the story of the gladiator who had brought the mighty republic to its knees became a source of inspiration and hope. Even in regions that had never experienced Roman rule, the tale of Spartacus became a powerful symbol of resistance to oppression. Medieval chroniclers, many of them writing in societies that had their own forms of bondage and social hierarchy, found in Spartacus a complex figure who challenged their own assumptions about the proper ordering of society. Some portrayed him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of social disorder, while others saw him as a hero who had stood up for the oppressed against their oppressors. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, and with it a more sympathetic understanding of Spartacus's achievements. Humanist scholars, many of them struggling against their own forms of political and religious oppression, found inspiration in the story of the slave who had nearly toppled an empire. Artists and writers began to portray Spartacus not as a barbarian rebel, but as a noble figure fighting for universal human values. The Enlightenment saw an explosion of interest in Spartacus as philosophers and political theorists grappled with questions of natural rights, social contracts, and the proper organization of society. Voltaire, Rousseau, and other influential thinkers used the example of Spartacus to argue against the arbitrary power of monarchs and the artificial hierarchies of European society. The democratic revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries explicitly drew on the example of Spartacus as a model for popular resistance to tyranny. The leaders of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and later democratic movements throughout Europe and Latin America all invoked his name and his example in their struggles against established authority. But it was in the modern era, as societies around the world began to seriously confront the legacy of slavery and other forms of systematic oppression, that Spartacus's story took on its full contemporary significance. The abolition movements of the 19th century, the labor movements of the industrial age, the civil rights struggles of the 20th century, all found in Spartacus a symbol of the eternal human drive for freedom and dignity. Karl Marx and other socialist theorists saw in the Spartacus rebellion a forerunner of the class struggle that they believed would ultimately transform modern society. The Spartacist movement in Germany, the various communist parties that adopted his name, and liberation movements throughout the developing world all drew inspiration from his example. But Spartacus's appeal has never been limited to any single political ideology. His story resonates with anyone who has faced oppression, anyone who has been told that their circumstances are natural and unchangeable, anyone who has dared to believe that a better world is possible. In this sense, he belongs not to any particular movement or moment in history, but to the ongoing human struggle for freedom, dignity, and justice. Today, more than 2,000 years after his death on a battlefield in southern Italy, Spartacus remains one of history's most powerful symbols of resistance to oppression. His name appears on monuments to freedom fighters around the world, in the titles of books about social justice, in the slogans of movements for human rights. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Spartacus is not found in any monument or slogan, but in the simple fact that his story continues to inspire people to believe that change is possible, that systems of oppression are not eternal, and that ordinary people, working together with courage and determination, can achieve extraordinary things. The gladiator from Thrace who refused to accept that some human beings were destined to be property of others created something that transcended his own time and place. He showed the world that the desire for freedom is universal, that the capacity for heroism exists in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the most profound victories come not from military success but from the moral example of those who are willing to sacrifice everything for principles larger than themselves. In the end, Spartacus did not overthrow the Roman Empire or end the institution of slavery. But he did something perhaps more important. He proved that such things were possible, that the seemingly impossible could be imagined and attempted, and that even in defeat, the struggle for human dignity could achieve a kind of immortality. His legacy reminds us that history is not simply the story of those who held power, but also of those who challenged it, not just of those who accepted the world as they found it, but of those who dared to envision and fight for the world as it might be. In this sense, Spartacus achieved the most complete victory possible, not over his enemies, but over the limitations that others tried to place on human possibility itself. The slave who almost toppled the Roman Empire showed us that no system of oppression is so strong that it cannot be challenged, no hierarchy so natural that it cannot be questioned, no dream of freedom so impossible that it is not worth pursuing. That lesson, born in the crucible of ancient slavery and tempered in the fires of rebellion, remains as relevant today as it was when Spartacus first stood up in a gladiator school in Capua and declared that he would rather die as a free man than live as a slave. And so the story of Spartacus continues, not as ancient history, but as a living reminder that the human spirit, once awakened to the possibility of freedom, can never be completely conquered. His rebellion may have lasted only 3 years, but his example has endured for over 2 millennia and will continue to inspire as long as there are people who believe that all human beings deserve to live with dignity, equality, and freedom. This is the true measure of Spartacus's achievement, not the battles he won or the armies he commanded, but the imperishable idea he embodied, that freedom is not a privilege to be granted by others, but a birthright to be claimed by all. In that sense, his rebellion never truly ended. It continues wherever people stand up to injustice, wherever the oppressed refuse to accept their oppression, wherever someone dares to believe that a better world is not just possible, but inevitable. The gladiator who became a general, the slave who became a symbol of freedom, the man who almost toppled an empire, Spartacus lives on not in monuments of stone or bronze, but in the unconquerable human conviction that no one is born to be another's property, and that all people, regardless of their circumstances, possess an inherent dignity that cannot be bought, sold, or destroyed.